Hello, everybody. I'm Isabel Hugal. Welcome to the first Borderline Live. I believe we have a few seconds delay, but you should be seeing me on LinkedIn and on YouTube in a second. I'm just going to have to mute a couple things and here we go. So welcome to Borderline Live on LinkedIn. I was inspired by my friends over at Hello Monday, the LinkedIn podcast by Jesse Hempel. They do these office hours, which I think are really fun every week. And I wanted to copy them essentially and just have a chance to exchange with you guys. So you might be seeing this because you're following me on LinkedIn. I used to be international editor at LinkedIn, and that's where a lot of you guys have known me from. I am now the founder and host of my own humble little media operation called Borderline, and I'm going to tell you about it for a minute. It's a podcast for Defiant Global Citizens, podcast newsletter, and it aspires to be more. The idea is to create a media for people whose lives straddle borders. And we talk about immigration and expatriation and geopolitics and all sorts of topics that are very dear to my heart because my life has been spent across borders as well. So I'd love to see so many of you guys say hello. Let me know where you're from. I see hi from South Africa. That's awesome. I see a lot of Turkish names. That's great. Hi from Tashkent. I love seeing you guys all over the world. So the idea for this office hours is to have a chance to chat with you guys about the topics I'm discussing on Borderline. So if you've listened to this week's episodes, happy to get your questions from this week's episode. Hello from Chile. Hi, Rixio. Hi from Spain. Hi, Vicen, Kenya, Kennedy, Jordan, Palestine, Algeria, Morocco. I can't keep up. Scotland. Hi, Elaine. That's a little bit closer to me. Argentina, Oman, Serbia, Venice, Italy. Oh, that sounds lovely. Saudi Arabia, Georgia, Jordan. I can't even read. You guys are going too fast. It's great to meet all of you. Brazil, Algeria, Beirut, Lebanon, Ivory Coast. So I thought it's great that we have people from all over the world because actually the topic I wanted to discuss today is around travel restrictions with COVID-19. France, that's my brother. Hello. Travel restrictions and COVID-19. So we all know the past year travel has been incredibly difficult, and perhaps rightly so. But I feel like people that have been kind of ignored from the conversation are people who travel for very, very legitimate reasons, and that's multinational families. So in the past, in 2020, actually, there's been 1 billion fewer international arrivals at ports of entry and airports around the world. That's about 3/4 of normal international traffic on the planet that has disappeared. So huge numbers. And rules were loosening at the end of 2020, according to these numbers are from the UN World Tourism Organization, who tracks these things. But however, in the past couple months, they've really been tightening up again as we've seen variants show up in a lot of countries be really worried about keeping their borders open. And one of the things I've actually found through my reporting on the podcast, well, two things really. One, I did one episode on travel restrictions and whether they actually work. And as much as I wanted them to tell me that they don't, they do. So unfortunately, that's something that we just kind of have to make our peace with. For those of us who are used to traveling a lot, they do make sense. I'm really curious, actually, if you want to chat in the comments, let me know if you have traveled in the past year and how it's gone. If you've been stopped from traveling, if you have family overseas and you're stuck from seeing them, because those are stories that I've been hearing a lot, and they kind of break my heart. And that's the other episode that I did last year on the situation in Australia. So Australia has been kind of a model, Australia and New Zealand both, with Please speak slowly. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I channel my best American sometimes. I will slow down. Um, so we have seen Australia and New Zealand kind of be shown as model of what to do with the pandemic, because they've actually been very effective in reducing the pandemic impact on their countries. And they've done so by essentially closing to the world. And sadly, by closing to the world, that has made life incredibly difficult for some of their own citizens. So, for instance, Australia has imposed travel caps. So they can only have, I think it's 4,000, last I checked, 4,000 arrivals, international arrivals into the country every week. Now, that's about 1% of what arrivals used to be before the pandemic. So even if you take out all the tourists, you still have a lot of legitimate travel, especially Australians overseas that have been blocked from returning home, or Australians who just had to leave during the pandemic. I talked to a man who, lives in Sydney, but he's of British origin, and his father was dying in London, and so he flew out to London to see his dad before he died, and bury his father, sadly. And he was then stuck in Australia and could not return because Australia would just not let him back in. And we're now seeing, and I've talked to dozens of families doing this. We're now seeing similar measures being implemented in the UK, for instance. So before I get to that, I'm seeing a lot of people on the stream, and some of you might be new to this. So just as a reminder, this is Borderline Office Hours. It's a podcast about lives that straddle borders. And I'm really curious to take your questions about what's going on for you in the world, especially if you're looking at traveling within the context of COVID-19. So in the UK, they've just started up these restrictions now of both very limited travel, that's fair, as well as quarantines when you arrive into the country. And finally, actually hotel quarantines hotels are selected by the government for people who come from so-called red list countries. So that's countries that are considered particularly dangerous. And those quarantines you have to pay for yourself. And right now the cost is £1,700 for every single individual who needs to be in quarantine. So if you're traveling as a family, it's unclear if it's going to be cheaper for children. But if you're traveling as a family, it's going to be particularly expensive. Rezwan is asking, when do you expect normalization of travel in and out? That's a great question, and I wish I had a crystal ball. We know that actually, weirdly, 2021 in some ways is harder for travel than 2020 was. What's happening is two things. Some countries either were really good from the get-go at controlling the pandemic, countries like Taiwan, like Australia and New Zealand, or they've had it really bad, and now they're getting it under control. For instance, in Europe, nowhere like near under perfect control yet, but we're kind of seeing the route to it, and that's the case in the UK, where vaccination is proceeding really quickly. So as countries get things under control, they're terrified of bringing the virus back in, just as they're controlling it domestically, and particularly variants, right? So there is a variant in the UK that continental Europe is quite scared of. But ironically, the UK itself is quite scared of bringing in other variants from abroad, particularly South Africa, and South America as well, Brazil particularly. And so countries are becoming stricter. So the UK, which had quite very few restrictions in 2020 is now becoming much harder, and that's true of continental Europe. So, for instance, I'm a French citizen. My family is in France, but I live in London. And in 2020, traveling between those two places was not easy, but a lot easier than it is now. And I was able to go and see my family a couple times during the year, particularly because I was a resident of the UK and a citizen of France, and neither country was keen on blocking their own citizens and their own residents. Now, however, France won't let even its own citizens home, which is unprecedented in our history, because usually the French Republic is very protective of its citizens abroad. So unless you have an absolute emergency, you're not allowed to go home. So right now, I cannot enter my own country. That's incredibly new and unusual. So long answer to your question, Rizwan. We're actually, in a way, seeing things tightening up more right now. Countries like Australia have already said that they're really not looking at letting people back in until at least 2022. And the travel industry, the airlines particularly, are not really expecting their businesses to be back to normal until 2024. So we're really, unfortunately, really not looking at normal life. Cezanne says, wow, £1,700 per head in addition to all the hassle. Yeah, I mean, and that's the problem with travel restrictions, is it's incredibly unequal. It's really bad for equity, essentially, because wealthier people who want to go abroad are going to be able to. But when you're looking at all of the immigrants with lower wages who are going to be facing those restrictions, they're actually going to be potentially blocked from seeing their families, their children, for months, years, if those restrictions aren't ended quickly. For instance, I read a story about a nurse, a man from the Philippines in New Zealand. His family is in the Philippines, and even though he's working on the front lines of fighting COVID in New Zealand, his family cannot join him, and his children are growing up without him. And I heard so many stories like this, unfortunately. Imtiaz Ahmed is asking about PhD programs. That's really going to depend on universities. I was just reading up the rules for New Zealand, and they've allowed 250 entries into the country for people in PhD programs, and it's up to universities to decide which ones of their PhD, which one of their doctorate students they want to give priority to. So again, that really depends on the countries, and I would encourage you to look at the rules of the particular programs that you're looking at, and talking to them as well. In a way, students, have been, because it's possible to do some of that work online and remotely, though maybe not nearly as efficiently. A lot of countries have not been very nice to foreign students in terms of allowing them back in. Same for immigration. A lot of the countries that I've looked at with really strict restrictions, they prioritize citizens and then permanent residents. And then they allow some people on work visas if they had been working in the country, before the pandemic, and they happened to be out of the country when the pandemic happened. People who are getting new visas right now for new jobs or new opportunities, those, again, depending on the countries, but Australia and New Zealand, they pretty much have no chance of getting in, from what I've seen. Really a trickle. I know people who have new jobs and who are waiting to move to new countries, and they're just kind of in the wings, waiting to be allowed to do that. So if that's your situation, I would love to hear your stories. Actually, do mention them in the comment. Payman says, I'm gonna skip the expletive. I'm from the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've got restrictions, but the whole statistics for coronavirus have got political, and people in the government here make money with the mere statistics. Okay. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, the situation gets extremely political in a lot of places. Also, what I've seen with travel restrictions is, unfortunately, it's not bringing out the best in people. So in Australia, for instance, people who are in the country have been extremely hard on their fellow citizens, on other Australians who are out of the country, really, really hard on social media, essentially saying, well, you should have gone home. When we first started hearing of a pandemic, you were told to go home. Your loss. And of course, that does not consider the fact that people maybe didn't need to go home at that point or couldn't go home for health reason because the country where they were was on lockdown. All sorts of situations like that. Or, like the man I was talking about who had to bury his father, he didn't need to go until his father got sick and he had to go. I talked to a woman in Australia, Sarah Weber, who was telling me, I feel stateless, like my country is completely given up, both my government and my fellow men. And then you have also even the people who are stuck abroad. I have seen, I'm in a Facebook group with a lot of Australians who are stranded. And it's not always pretty either, because people are fighting for who should have priority in terms of going home. And so I've seen people essentially complain that foreigners were allowed into the country and they weren't. Now, of course, those foreigners might very well have very valid reasons to enter and be working in the country and have valid visas and all of that. So it's not as easy as, kind of you've got the passport, you're allowed in, but it's kind of the same thing with visa, with the vaccines and people, wanting first in line to the vaccine. It's not always bringing out the best in human beings, unfortunately. Please keep sending your questions. I think I've gone through all the ones that I've gotten so far. One thing that I want to really point out with all these questions of travel restrictions that has really frustrated me is coverage in media, which is international travel. I don't know what it's like where you are. And actually, I'd love to hear, what it's like in your countries. But in the UK, pretty much all the media coverage of travel restrictions has centered around holidays. And even the Telegraph had this big headlines, about how there would be fines for holiday makers who lied about going abroad. It's pretty frustrating because for a lot of us, going abroad is not about, taking the sun and going for a cheeky holiday. It's our lives. It's meeting our families. It's, couples, the married couples, sometimes who live in different countries, children who live in a different country from their parents or one of their parents because their parents are separated, adults like me who are working abroad but have family back in their own country. And so we're really not just talking about holidays. I think, if you ask me at this point, if you're banning holidays, I'm like, yeah, that seems fair. Doesn't seem like the right time for it, at least where we are here in the pandemic. But it is a very, very different story for families. And again, the restrictions might very well be justified. It would just be nice if they were discussed in a way that considered the impact on multinational families. Cezanne says 2022 for open entry and 2024 for business stability. Yeah, that's kind of what it's looking like. 2022 for open entry would be nice. I would actually, I hope so. I think that's really going to depend on the rollout of the vaccine. And if, knock on wood, there's not any new variants that throw a spanner in the works. And that's going to be really depending on countries as well. Unfortunately, the vaccine is not at all fairly distributed around the planet. We know that a lot of poorer countries are like way down the line in terms of getting doses from pharmaceutical companies. And we also know that maybe some countries that have had less to deal with the pandemic, even rich countries, are therefore not vaccinating tons. Australia hasn't started its vaccination program. So it's going to be a very tiered way out of this pandemic. And for travel and for all other things, I think in the beginning we really imagined that we were, going to have ticker tape parades on the streets on the day that we're done. And unfortunately, that it's not looking that way. Have the impact of these restrictions been well thought out? Well, yeah, as I was saying, no, not for a lot of international families. For goods, it looks, there hasn't been that I've seen food shortages or anything like that. So, goods have gone through. Well, we have to deal with Brexit here, which is a different story. But for families, it hasn't been considered. Particularly, we haven't got a clear sense of when those measures might be reevaluated, where the goalposts are in terms of deciding whether it's been successful or whether it's still required. So right now, it's a unending kind of restriction for the UK, at least, where we know it's going to go into summer, possibly into the autumn, and we haven't been told when and how it would even be reevaluated, let alone ended. So that's the story. Francois says, yes, explaining the Australian restrictions, need to have travel exemption to leave the country, then stay in quarantine when they're coming back. Yes, and those restrictions are pretty much never given out. PCR tests as well have become kind of a given to get in and out of a lot of countries. Kareem say we control the pandemic in Egypt. That's interesting. I don't know. I was talking to an Egyptian friend last week, and she was she wasn't of the same opinion. So I'm interested to hear what you're seeing. She was saying essentially that people were just living as they used to, but there were tons of people in hospital still. So people aren't panicked, but people are kind of sort of dealing with it as they could, and made their peace with it. It's interesting too, and I don't want to presume because I haven't been there, I haven't reported there. But you have a lot of countries where the population is much younger, and so the impact is going to be very different as well. MTS, we had second dose of the vaccine here, and I think this will work. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a vaccine expert. I trust entirely the authorities that have determined that it is a safe and effective vaccine, and I am patiently waiting for my spot in line, and I will take it when I can. Ugor says we lost control of the pandemic in Turkey. I'm sorry to hear. Tell me more. What it's like in Turkey right now. Cameron, lots of confusion on vaccines. I don't know. I'm not that confused personally, but I know there's information that a lot of misinformation that's traveling. I think at this point, it's been millions of people have been vaccinated safely and effectively. So personally, that's not something that I'm concerned about. My main concern is how quickly can I get it, and how quickly can my loved ones get it. Hi, Portugal. Hi from Syria. We have another few minutes going on the live, so we're going to run until the half hour. So let me know if you have further questions about travel restrictions. This live has been a bit of a monologue. Future ones will have guests. I just didn't want to impose a first attempt on a guest should things go poorly, but I think I've got this technology down, and I love that you're all here listening to my rambling. So next one we'll definitely have a guest so we can chat about the episodes that we have going on. If you don't know Borderline, by the way, this is my podcast. It's fairly new. You can subscribe at borderlinepod.com. We just launched a new season. There was a great episode this week, she says humbly, but a great guest someone I really enjoyed, Peter Gumbel, who talked about his own sort of grappling with identity. He's a British man of German Jewish origin. His family had to flee Germany during World War II, settled in Britain, and so he's a British man. And then with Brexit, he felt really torn about losing his European identity. He went back to Germany, to get a German passport. And so we talked about what that has felt like. Get Dr. Fauci next. He'll answer questions on vaccines. Yes. Tony, man, if you want to come on this LinkedIn Live, please do. You're always welcome. And on the podcast, that would be nice. But if there are guests, maybe a slightly more gettable guest for a small independent podcast that you want me to talk to, do come in. Hi, Jill. Thanks for sharing your insights. You're very welcome. Thanks for listening and joining in. It's great. Cameron said airlines are restricted and have limits on travelers, but in place we notice seat by seat passengers in violation of SOPs. What's SOPs? Cameron, can you spell that out for me? I'm not great with acronyms. Yes, airlines are restricted. So it's interesting, actually, countries with tight arrival caps have airlines can't fill their planes. And so it doesn't make business sense for them to even fly those planes. And so you have countries where essentially, because of the restrictions they've put in place, they've shut themselves to the rest of the world because airlines aren't even interested in flying there. And so that makes it extra difficult for people trying to return home, that they can't even find a seat on a plane, or they have to pay business class, which is insanely expensive. If you're flying from Europe to Australia, for instance, that is going to be, several thousands of dollars. And if it's for a family, I remember seeing one family who family of 4 or 5, and they had to get business class tickets for everyone, plus hotel quarantines, self-funded for everyone. And their bill was somewhere like like near $100,000. SOPs, face mask, sanitizer. Okay, so like measures, precautions. Yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously, when traveling, like, please wear your masks. I mean, everywhere, please wear your masks. That is so important. I think it's been really challenging for airline staff. If you're a flight attendant, you're not necessarily trained to handle having to explain how viruses work and why people should wear their masks. And people in retail and in airlines have been getting so much abuse from people who aren't being reasonable with their masks, unfortunately. We're getting to the end of the hour, or the end of the half hour. So please drop your final questions, if any. I appreciate everyone listening. Again, the podcast is at borderlinepod.com, and you'll find all the information. There's a couple episodes that I think you might find interesting related to these things we discussed today. They are on the website on borderlinepod.com, you'll find them. But there's an episode on stranded Australians and how travel restrictions in Australia have impacted people. Some really heartbreaking stories. And then there's an episode called "Do COVID-19 Travel Restrictions Actually Work?" And for that episode, I talked to a couple epidemiologists about how and whether travel restrictions even work. I think a big worry was like, well, kind of, is it closing the barn door after the horses have bolted? Long story short, they do help with a lot of caveats, and it was a really interesting thing to research and do an episode on. Okay, I've got a couple final questions. Gary, I read today that Scotland could be looking at COVID elimination strategy. Not sure that would be possible. What's your thoughts? Yeah, I've had some thoughts on that. But because I'm not an epidemiologist, I want to be mindful. I think the problem with COVID elimination is if you're doing it in your country, then you're closing your country to the rest of the world until the entire world has it eliminated. And given how bad we are at quickly producing and sharing the vaccine, you're looking at countries being closed to the rest of the world for years and years. So eradication has happened once in human history, eradication of disease. That was That was smallpox. You're looking at polio, um, which is a campaign I've followed a bit. The there are a lot of very smart and wealthy people who've been trying to eliminate polio for decades. The Rotary has been extremely involved, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we still haven't eradicated polio. So I personally don't see it. Again, I'm not an expert. For Australia, what are the processes? Sorry, Cezanne asks, for Australia, what really are the processes and procedure for entry? My brother's family resides there while he is here in Nigeria. Does not look good not seeing his family for 2 years. I am so sorry for him. Unfortunately, it is extremely difficult. So the process is, if he needs essentially to apply for his family to return if they are regularly residents of Australia, and they need to apply to and then find plane tickets for them, and then they'll need to be in quarantine for 2 weeks when they return. I would encourage him to contact the DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia. They have a whole list and resources, but to be honest, it's really incredibly difficult today. Tanmoy, hey, good to see you. Thank you. Imtiaz, really appreciate this conversation. Thanks, me too, even though I feel like I'm monologuing a bit, but I'm glad this is being helpful to you guys. François my brother, obviously. As you can tell from the last name, the only countries that have managed to get COVID largely under control are islands. Good luck, Scotland. Yeah, I mean, the UK is an island, so like the UK on its own could. Scotland on its own might be a little bit more difficult, but even islands need to get in touch with the rest of the world. I think, even if New Zealand kind of is in the best geographical situation and they're essentially living their best lives, but they're closed off from the rest of the world. They're having concerts and festivals and whatnot, but they're closed off from the rest of the world. I don't know how long that can last. And they're a tiny country. They don't have a lot of people stuck abroad, though they do as well. And so I don't know how long that's going to last. Alfred, thank you. Good luck with future episodes. Yeah, please listen, subscribe to the newsletter to hear more, and I'll be back with another episode shortly, both of the lives and of the podcast. The podcast comes out on Sunday for members if you want to support the podcast and become a member, and it comes out on Tuesday to the public. Next episode, and therefore next LinkedIn Live session, we're going to talk about being an exchange student, which was a big part of my life. And I talked to someone who was an exchange student as well, and it was a big part of her life. And we're going to talk about how to have a successful year as an exchange student, what it does for in someone's life, how important it is, why you should all be hosting exchange student and encouraging teenagers in your life to be exchange students. So make sure that they listen. It might inspire them. And if you have your own stories to share, come back for LinkedIn Live next week. I'm going to end the feed. Questions. I've seen a few questions about vaccines. I'm extremely careful to only speak to things that I am qualified to speak on, and the vaccine isn't it. I trust the authorities on this, and I will be getting my vaccine as soon as I'm allowed to get it, and I cannot wait. So I'll talk to you next Thursday, this time with a guest, and we'll talk about exchange students again. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoy the podcast. It's at borderlinepod.com. I'll put all the links in the comment as soon as I'm done here. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening, day, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.